Hey guys, theology has completely lost credibility in this world and it is basically irrelevant. I'm going to give you 4 reasons why that is the case, and I'm going to give you one way out. Let's go. Zero credibility and no relevance anymore. What are the reasons? Number 1, abandoning the origin story, which is of course Jesus. If you take anyone from the time of Jesus and you brought them into our world today, and leaving aside, the huge cultural differences, how we live and how we think and all the rest of it, but if you drill down in terms of what drives us and the underlying values, they wouldn't recognize any of it. And again, I'm not saying that because of the way the world has changed. I'm saying it because that story was fundamentally abandoned and is still being abandoned today. So what did Jesus actually do? Well, for starters, he confronted the human condition. And that meant he stood up to the idolatries of this world, the idolatrous powers of this world. And he lived an alternative story. Within less than 100 years, that story has been abandoned, was abandoned, still is being abandoned. Let's focus on the positive thing first. There was this guy called Paul, often maligned, because people don't understand how brilliantly he actually took the subversion that Jesus brought to this human story. He lived it out, and he turned it into practice by decentralizing this notion of God's people. But we abandoned that within decades. Unbelievable. We moved in a completely different direction as if Jesus had never happened. Another example, Luther, or you might say Luther, the dude around 1500 in Germany. Now, we're talking about the Reformation here, which is basically when Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism kind of split off, or Protestantism split off from Roman Catholicism. And people talk a lot about what worked and didn't work about that and all the rest of it, different denominations and so on. That's not my point here. My point is Luther, for all his faults, actually tried to find a way back to the story of origin. Why? Because he understood that we abandon it. Okay, so that's number 1. And how does that work itself out throughout church history, world history, I should say? Well, it's kind of interesting that Freudian slipped there, church history, world history, because the two become one and the same. If you look at church history for about 1900 years or so, actually maybe a little bit more than that even, you can see how the church, and now everyone's talking about the church in the singular, which I think is a big mistake, how the church is constantly kind of cozying up to the powers of this world instead of subverting them, challenging them, and living out an alternative to them, which is fundamentally at the core of the gospel for which Jesus died on the cross. So if you wanted to know more about this and you sign up to warehousetheology.com, we actually go through this in some detail. Anyway, that's number 1, the abandoned origin story. Number 2, assimilation to idolatry. If you go on that trip, that church historical trip or that world history trip, and you look at church or churches and their role in it, you will find that there is way more assimilation than there is subversion. That's a huge problem. I mean, the very core of the gospel, again, is not assimilation, it is subversion. If you don't subvert, if you simply become that condition that you're supposed to challenge, then all hope is lost. Let me give you an example. 2016, we had 4 years of this president, and the role the evangelical church played in that is absolutely nauseating. Nauseating. Just think of the pictures of how those leaders had their hands on his shoulders and the stunts he pulled with a Bible, that time when he held the Bible upside down and in DC and cleared they cleared the square for him and all of that. It is absolutely abominable. Evangelical leaders, the way they talk about politics, it's a disaster. It's an embarrassment, and it's the perfect example for what happens when churches and church leaders assimilate to whatever they happen to like, with no respect for somebody's morality, for the origin story, for the need to subvert the idolatries of this world rather than to cozy up to them. Number 3. The church, by and large, and the church leaders, by and large, have nothing to say to the world. I don't know if you've ever noticed that churches and church leaders, pastors, they mostly have things to say to each other. pastors to the congregation, sometimes the congregation to the pastor. But do they ever have anything to say to the world? To my knowledge, that rarely happens. Number 4. A hermeneutical void. Hermeneutics is about how humans interpret stuff. The one thing we always do even when we sleep. The only thing we always do while we breathe. Okay, so that too. Hermeneutics, understanding stuff. Intellectual credibility. Where is it? Where did it go? There are theologians teaching in seminaries and theological schools up and down the country and around the world who have zero understanding, hyperbole, okay, of hermeneutics. They think hermeneutics is like a checklist of steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what you do with a biblical text. I mean, that is nonsense. But that actually brings me to something that is also a huge problem. I still leave it under this 4th point, and that is that Christians will readily and happily develop their own approach to interpreting the Bible, which carries no credibility in the world, nor does it actually carry any intellectual credibility. And yet, somehow, when you deal with the Bible, you're supposedly free to do this kind of thing. That is just deadly. If somebody looks on and sees that kind of thing happening, they'll just walk away from it. And they should, frankly. So those are briefly 4 reasons. Of course, there are others, but I contend that most of the other reasons have to do directly with any of these 4. What's the way out of this? Well, the solution, of course, is, if you believe what I'm putting forward here, the solution has to be that you somehow find a way of reversing those 4 points. And I want to focus on the one that I mentioned, I think it was number 3. We have nothing to say. Christians have nothing to say to the world, only have stuff to say to each other, and then the world can come in if they want, because we've cordoned ourselves off from the world. But if they're brave enough and they don't mind becoming like us, and they can walk through the door and have participation in this intramural world. Okay, so that can't be good enough. That's never good enough. So nothing to say to the world. How do you turn that around? How can Christians actually end up with something that they have to say, that they can bring to the world? The religious message of Christianity is basically lost. That's the abandonment of the origin story. I already mentioned that. What else could possibly happen to help Christians have a voice in this world, regain some kind of voice? Here's what I'm thinking. If we could come up with ways that are truly human, that are not special interests, that are not idolatrous, that are not built on assimilation to the world, but that are truly human in the sense of how we function as human beings. And we can demonstrate that those ways work just as well for faith, for making sense of faith, as they do for making sense of other things in the world, including things as mundane as, for instance, professional development. If we can do that, then we have some hope. And then we also gain some credibility. If we can, for instance, deliver professional development that is based on the same knowledge, the same intellectual values as the ones that govern our faith, then immediately our faith gains in credibility. That has got to be an important part of the way out of this. I'll say more about this some other time. That's it.